welcome to the program. I'm Anthony Bardaway with UATV. Joining us over video today is Lincoln Mitchell, a political researcher, commentator, and author who specializes in political development in the post-Soviet space. Mr. Mitchell, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So one of your specializations is Georgia specifically, and after the Rose Revolution, there were a significant amount of political changes that have happened, similar to what happened in Ukraine. So what parallels can you draw between the political developments that happened in Georgia post-Rose Revolution and Ukraine post-Maidan Revolution?
Well, that's a very interesting way to look at it. In both cases, a government came in that was very much committed to being part of the West. Now, the Rose Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution were, of course, quite different. The Yanukovych regime that was ousted in the Euromaidan movement was considerably stronger and by the end, considerably more forceful than the Shevardnadze government. The Shevardnadze government was incompetent and corrupt, but wasn't vitriolic and violent towards the people. There was no shooting in Tbilisi in 2004, and that is very significant. Since that time, Ukraine has had a foreign invader, which changed the dynamic. Georgia had, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but that had occurred really a decade ago. So it didn't have that dynamic. A major difference is that Georgia, following the Rose Revolution, had one leader who was really able to unify the country and to really reshape the Georgian vision and reshape what it meant for Georgia, what Georgia's future should be, and build a consensus around that. Now, in Ukraine, you got the kind of later Saakashvili when he really wasn't hitting on all cylinders and wasn't as strong a politician and as competent a politician and as charismatic a politician as he once was. But here he was all those things. And in Ukraine, the politics were much more contested. Shevardnadze's government was replaced by a powerful one-party, dominant party that became a system of one-party rule within 4 years. Ukraine remains much more contested and much more pluralist. And I think in the short run, that's very difficult for Ukraine because everything is fought out. It's very hard for Poroshenko to get a consensus on anything. It slows down reforms. But in the longer run, it may, in fact, lead to a better democracy, a stronger democracy in Ukraine. Ultimately, what happened in Georgia was the Saakashvili government lost an election in 2012. And, what that was about was very debated and complex as well.
So one of these issues that Georgia has been facing is this idea of a frozen conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In Ukraine, many people are worried that Donbass could itself become a frozen conflict. So just recently, for example, Georgia had another couple, I think it was 700 meters or so, just annexed overnight. So do you think if Donbass does become a Georgian frozen conflict, is that the future that Ukraine could look forward to in a way, just the creeping annexation, or do you see something else?
Well, I might say that as Russia continues to expand its territory within Georgia, or the area that it has annexed within Georgia, that means the conflict is not frozen. It's in fact active. It may not be a complete shooting war, but it is active. Russia continues its aggression in Georgia. Unfortunately, I think the analogy is not a bad one. If I were looking at Ukraine, you could see the Donbass region ending up the way, for example, Abkhazia has right now, where Russia is there. It continues just by its presence there to make Georgia not whole. If Russia continues its presence in Donbass, Ukraine will fight for its territorial integrity going forward, and it will make it very hard for Ukraine to move toward the West and make it very hard to think about things like NATO or further the European Union. So unfortunately, that's a very good analogy. And there are some other pieces of it as well. I think the IDP crisis is more violent. It's more of a problem here in Georgia, just the sheer numbers, relatively speaking. But in Ukraine, it's much more of a shooting war than it has been in Georgia for years. It was briefly a shooting war in 2008 and really hasn't been since then. We could see that kind of conflict continuing in the Donbass region for a while until some kind of peace settlement is really reached out and held to. And that may not be one that is particularly good for Kyiv. So I'm not, I hope for the best, but I'm not optimistic.
And the other side of that, of course, is that many people in Ukraine have said, like, calm down internal dissent so long as we have this shooting war happening in the East. Whereas with Georgia, it has been making progress, significant progress with these reforms, even with these conflicts in place, even though, as you said, it hasn't necessarily been a shooting war for most of it. So do you have any thoughts on this idea?
Well, I spent a lot of time working on democracy issues around the world. And my sense is if you don't believe that democracy is the best system of government when there is a war going on, then you don't believe in democracy. So, no, the voices, in the political voices, whether it's on issues of the economy or fighting corruption or indeed what to do about Russia, the Donbass, and Crimea, for example, in Ukraine, those voices should be heard now. Dissent is patriotic if it is patriotic in its nature, even during times of conflict. So this is not a time to silence voices. And in fact, the biggest misstep that Georgia made was mishandling the crisis that to a large extent was created by Russia in the summer of 2008, which led to or contributed to a war that was really not good for Georgia. And it is my view that had there been more democracy in Georgia in 2008, the first half of 2008, following the crackdown in 2007, we saw the one-party state consolidated in Georgia, and we saw dissenting voices that tried to tell the president, you're going down a foolish path. And we saw those voices ignored, and they were kind of pushed aside and marginalized into the political life. That was a big mistake for Georgia. I would urge Ukraine not to make that mistake.
Okay, and I'll continue that looking less domestically, more internationally. For example, both Georgia and Ukraine have been making significant steps towards NATO integration, if not NATO membership necessarily. But there is the issue of NATO membership will be hard to come by so long as there's a threat of the Article 5. So do you see these conflicts as preventing further integration with the West? And how can that be counteracted?
I think there are people within NATO who see it that way, and their opinion matters more than mine. My view is that, Article 5 is significant and it's important, and we've seen that it works, right? And the example I like to give, unfortunately, because it's not a good one for Ukraine, is that, there are countries on Russia's borders that are much weaker militarily, economically, and much smaller than Ukraine, and thus more vulnerable. But Russia didn't invade Latvia, for example. And the reason is they take Article 5, Moscow takes Article 5 seriously. So the security guarantees in Article 5, regardless of what it says about NATO, and we're going to maybe have another conversation about what it means today with our current American president and his views on Article 5. But Article 5 has proven to be very powerful. Unfortunately, that is precisely why Russia wants to make sure Georgia and Ukraine don't get into NATO. And there are some in NATO who, honestly believe, and there's certainly an argument to be made, I may not agree with it, I may or may not, but that as Ukraine and Georgia get into NATO, Russia will fight hard to stop that from happening. And that may, in fact, lead to yet another war or another set of. So this Article 5 dynamic is very complicated and is clearly the stumbling block. But on the other hand, without Article 5, what's kind of the point of NATO for Georgia if you're sitting in Tbilisi or where you are in Kiev?
Of course, that's the reason why it's wanted. And for my final question, I'll ask about how Ukraine and Georgia, they've been following very parallel routes recently, for example, visa-free regimes. And how much direct cooperation have there been between the Ukrainian and Georgian governments towards Europeanization?
Well, I am told, I'm in Batumi now, but I was in Tbilisi having a series of meetings last week and some meetings here in Batumi as well. I am told that there has been much more cooperation in the last 12 to 18 months than in the period before that. That is a positive sign. These are two countries that are natural allies that share common goals, where there is a great affinity between the people. I mean, I won't say it on television because it involves profanities, but when I was walking down Rustaveli Avenue, you see people with shirts that say, free Ukraine, and then a profanity, and then the Russian president's name. And that's in Tbilisi. So they support the Ukrainian people. And I know the Ukrainian people would like to see Russian troops out of
as well, yes.
so out of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So there is a commonality there. One of the stumbling blocks was the presence of the former Georgian president, who is discredited and viewed by the government and a large chunk of the population as, a criminal, having a senior role in the Ukrainian government. That was something that I know that many of the people I know, both at very senior levels within the Georgian government, but also just kind of civil society activists, members of parliament, really couldn't figure out why Poroshenko would do that, and why he would fall for kind of Saakashvili's song and dance at this point. Now that he's not part of the government, that problem has gone away.
Okay, thank you very much for talking to us today. We're glad to have you on at any other time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Goodbye. With us today was Lincoln Mitchell, a political scientist who specializes in the post-Soviet space, especially Georgia. He talked to us today about cooperation between Ukraine and Georgia and the parallel paths that they have taken. Thank you very much for watching.